Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm Ukrainian Canadian. Today is August 23rd, 2024, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? So we'll talk about, first of all, the map updates. We'll go over the Kursk Offensive. We'll talk about a new offensive that the Ukrainian forces started in Kharkiv. We'll talk about the difficult front line in Donbass, where the Russians continue to push, and also some updates around Russia. Some positive ones. So first, let's talk about the Ksk Offensive. It's going very well. The Ukrainians continue to push. And to be fair with you guys, of course, the momentum has decreased. The Ukrainians are not gaining as much territory compared to the amount that they were gaining in the beginning of this operation on August 6th. But the Ukrainians are doing a smart thing right now, and they're really focusing on lengthening the territory they occupy right now. So instead of trying to push deep within Kursk territory and try to go towards the nuclear power plant, which is right around here, and Kursk city, the Ukrainians are trying to actually expand on the west side and on the east side, and a little bit in the north, but not trying to be too daring, because there's always a risk of their supplies being cut off, the Russians being able to counterattack, and the Russians have started building defensive lines around the highway which connects Kursk to Rilsk. So this makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to be able to break through there and build strong supply lines to be able to resupply its forces with all the necessities of war. So right now, what Ukraine is doing is really focusing in Glushkovo district, so this region that we talked about in my previous video, where the Ukrainians destroyed 3 key bridges that linked this sector for the Russians, because there was a river that passes through. So they destroyed all the bridges and also the pontoon bridges that the Russian engineers started setting up. But the Ukrainians have full fire control over these pontoon bridges that they try to set up all over the river, where they can find a narrow body of water through this river. So the Ukrainians, we can anticipate the Ukrainian military to be able to capture this territory within the next few weeks. The pushes are slow, and the Ukrainians are not taking any risks by trying to just push as hard as they can. They try to surround Russian positions, and there are Russian forces present here. Some rumors claim that there could be up to 3,000 Russian soldiers. I doubt it, to be personally honest with you. I don't think it's 3,000. It's probably way less. And indeed, the Russians are still capable of transporting some supplies, but it's very difficult for them. They're pretty much trapped in this sector. So I'm anticipating the Ukrainians to capture this territory in the next few weeks and really try to hold it. Perhaps if they'll be a little bit, they'll dare a little bit, they'll try to go for Rilsk, because this is an important city which connects a lot of settlements, and it has an important junction for the Russian military. So if the Ukrainians have enough forces, they could go and try to go for Rilsk after they take Koronevo. But overall, you're seeing that the Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the territory that they currently have, dig in and try to gain a little bit more, but I'm not so sure that they're going to try to go for even more territory. So overall, things are going really well in Kursk, and as I said as well, our expectations need to be grounded. I seriously doubt that Ukraine will try to go further and further towards the nuclear power plants or Kursk city. At this stage, I think that it's pretty clear that Ukraine will try to consolidate kind of this area over here. So either way, this is excellent, because we know that the paradigm shifts have started. The fact that Ukraine was able to even attack and occupy territory for now almost 3 weeks, we're heading into week number 3 of this offensive, and the Russians not being able to counterattack really shows that they lack the troops to be able to protect this entire border that they have with Ukraine. And it really kills this narrative that Russia will advance no matter what. And as I've said in my previous videos, one of the paradigm shifts that is really important is that, first of all, the nuclear bluffing, the saber rattling that Russia's been doing for the last 2.5 years, and especially when we talk about a potential offensive on Russian territory, the Russians always said it's impossible. If we get invaded, we'll strike back with nuclear weapons. We're now at week number 3, and there is no response from Russia yet. So you can see that this is clearly a bluff from the Russian side. Additionally, one thing I want to mention is that we also saw and are currently seeing the difference between the Ukrainian military and society and its moral values compared to the Russian moral values. And what I'm talking about is the difference between what we saw in early February of 2022 when the Russians attacked and invaded and occupied Ukrainian territory, and all of the atrocities that we saw happen, whether it be in Irpin, Bucha, Kherson, Mariupol. We saw so many difficult images and videos of all the crimes that the Russians committed against the Ukrainian population. No help was given to the locals that were struggling to have basics, and all of the stories that we don't yet know that are currently happening in Ukraine. And now let's compare it to the Ukraine occupation of Kursk, and we're seeing two completely different pictures. The Ukraine military is trying to provide the basic necessities for the local population, is assisting them, is trying to really make the situation as comfortable as they can for the local population that stayed in the region that Ukraine currently occupies in Kursk. And we're seeing that. And Ukraine is behaving itself like a proper Western military, not shooting up civilians, torturing them, kidnapping kids and things like that. The Ukrainians are setting up local administration bodies to help out the locals with basic necessities and other things. Like, Ukraine is really showing the difference. And that is also really positive because Ukraine also displays the good guy, right, image to the world, which is also really important. Now, if we go to another front line, let's talk about Kharkiv. And in Kharkiv, there's some really positive news as well. So the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade confirmed with us that they've started a new offensive operation around the Kharkiv, Luhansk area. And what we're talking about specifically is the around this area of Novodiane, if I remember correctly. So the Ukrainians launched an operation here to try to dislodge, and I believe it's the 252nd Rifle Regiment, if I remember correctly. So around Makivka and Novodiane, the Ukrainians launched an operation here. And as far as we're concerned, there's the updates, yeah. So Deep State, I was a little bit too far back, but you can see a Deep State updated. So of course, this is a small counterattack by the Ukrainians, but they mentioned that they managed to destroy an entire battalion that was situated here, a very big battalion. And the Ukrainian operation by the 3rd Assault Brigade managed to push them out of this position. And they actually featured a little trailer yesterday showcasing this operation, which started a few days ago. So the situation is still unclear, but it appears that the Ukrainians are also launching an attack here because they're, I guess, seeing that they might have an opportunity in breaking through the Russian positions. And we're seeing that back in late 2022, early 2023, the Ukrainians actually were very close to Svatove, but unfortunately the Russians afterwards managed to counterattack and they pushed the Ukrainians out of this key highway that connects to Svatove. So an area that we need to keep under the loop, and I'll keep you guys updated if there's any changes here. But it's also good to see that the Ukrainians are also launching counteroffensive in this sector in Ukraine. Another thing we need to talk about is, of course, Chasiv Yar and the Pokrovsk front line. So this front line is the most difficult. This is the current punch that the Russians are trying to, the big blow that they're trying to give to the Ukrainian military. And I told you guys a few videos ago, I've talked specifically about this front line, that I shouldn't say not as worried, but I'm confident that the Ukrainian military will be able to hold this front line for the next few months. And one of the main reasons is we know, and I shared with you guys, that Pokrovsk specifically is a city of the same size of Bakhmut. And we remember how much time it took the Russians to take Bakhmut with elite forces. Yes, there were conscripts and other criminals and prisoners that took part of this operation, but Russia had a lot more men and also resources. And at this stage, we know how much the Russians lost trying to liberate this entire section, territory from Avdiivka all the way up to Pokrovsk. This is about half a year worth of progress for the Russians. at an insanely high cost for them. Yes, they have taken territory here, but once they reach a very urban area like Pokrovsk, this is where the situation turns really sour and bad for the Russians, and they've started hitting it. Novohorodivka is kind of a big settlement, which will take some time for the Russians to try to get through. So this is one defensive line that the Russians will have to face, and they're currently facing. Hrodivka, Mykolaiivka, you can see the Ukrainians have the height advantage here, and it will not be easy for the Russians to push through, because you can see that between Hrodivka and Stepove, it was pretty much open fields. And of course, the Ukrainians didn't have much to fall back to. They didn't have a second defensive line, but I think that the Ukrainians were already anticipating after the fall of Avdiivka to build some defenses around this sector. So I believe that after Hrodivka, Mykolaiivka, Novohrodivka, it will be a bloodbath for the Russians. Not that it won't be for the Ukrainian forces, unfortunately, but we've seen how much better the Ukrainians, how they can turn this into positive, making it a kind of a sunk cost fallacy for the Russians, where they're going to just throw as many resources as they need and as they can to be able to take a city like Pokrovsk, because it's very symbolic at this point, right? This is the kind of crown jewel that they're aiming for, but it will be very difficult, and we know how terrible the Russians do in urban warfare. Look at Mariupol, look at Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, recently Avdiivka, a city that was much smaller than Bakhmut. It took the Russians 5 to 6 months to take it, at around 50,000 casualties during those 6 months. Just terrible losses for the Russians. We know that their capabilities only decrease as time goes by. It's obviously happening, right? So this is why I'm not as worried in terms of, yes, right now the Russians are gaining a lot of territory, but once they start reaching urban areas, it will be really, really difficult for them to break through 100 meters, 50 meters. Just look at Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar has the same situation, right? For the last few months, this has been pretty much the front line, where the Russians are trying to break through to Chasiv Yar, a much smaller city, and they're struggling because it's an urban, open area where the Ukrainians do have a height advantage. So it will not be easy for the Russians here, and including New York and Toretsk. So once the Russians started hitting and entering areas, these urban areas, which they have, it will be very, very slow gains for them. And maybe even the Ukrainians will be able to hold them off long enough that winter sets, and then the Russians will lose a lot of maneuverability and hiding abilities, because we know that the Russians are moving now with very small squads of about 5 to 10 people, and they're constantly just throwing new waves of attacks. So instead of having those huge meat waves, now they constantly throw units on rotation. Well, not on rotation, but it's just wave after wave of small units that are on motorcycles, buggies, all-terrain vehicles. So for them, then they can go hide in these urban settlements or even posadkas, and then it becomes very difficult for the Ukrainians to dislodge them. So this is why I'm telling you guys, yes, we should anticipate more Russian gains in this sector between Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk, but once they start hitting really big urban areas, it's going to be very slow for them, and the Ukrainians are capable of defending for the long term. So I don't think it's as critical as many claim it to be, but of course, anything can happen. And one thing that keeps me very optimistic is that the Ukrainians at the same time are really destroying Russian logistics. And what I'm talking about is, of course, the recent, well, yesterday was truly a horrible day for Russia, which means a very wonderful day for all of us. First of all, in Volgograd, I share with you guys a picture of a UAV attack by the Ukrainians in a military airfield called the Marinovka airfield. Based on satellite images, during the attack, the Russians had parked a few Su-24s and 34s under hangars, and there appears to be an ammunition depot right beside, full of glide bomb kits, which then explains why there was such a massive explosion after the attack by the UAVs. And some pictures now were released on the ground by workers, cleanup workers, that confirmed that the Russians did lose a few jet fighters. It's unconfirmed exactly how many, but there was, I believe, an Su-34 confirmed, 100% that was destroyed, and also an Su-24 that was destroyed here. And also a massive detonation of the glide bomb kit close to those hangars. So a really great hit by the Ukrainians, which further complicates the Russian operations. We know one of the reasons why they're capable of really advancing quickly in Donbass right now is because they can drop these bombs, glide bombs, about 60 to 70 kilometers away from the front line, which keeps them pretty safe from Ukraine air defense systems. And then they wreak havoc once they fall on Ukrainian positions, because they have such a big destructive power, and the Ukrainians know that. So that's where they're really striking and focusing on destroying as many airfields that have these critical jet fighters present and those glide bomb kits as well on the airfield. So this is an excellent operation, and I'm sure that's not the first or the last operation that Ukraine's going to conduct. Additionally, another important update, the Rostov Proletarsk oil depot. So I share with you guys the images of the explosions that occurred on that oil depot following another Ukrainian UAV attack. And Proletarsk is right over here. So the Ukrainians attacked a massive oil depot complex, I believe one of the biggest in Russia. It had about 70 cisterns of fuel, and pretty much all of them are burning now. The firefighters are unable to take control over this fire, and it's a complete loss for the Russians. It's still burning after 6 days, and there's like 400 firefighters apparently fighting this fire, but everybody's given up. This entire oil depot is a total loss for the Russians. So another great attack by the Ukrainians, because we know how close Proletarsk is to Donbass, to Donetsk. So certainly the Russians were utilizing this oil depot to resupply and refuel its troops in occupied territory in Ukraine. So a massive loss for the Russians here. And the cherry on top, the Ukrainians yesterday also attacked the Kafas Port, which is right beside the Kursk bridge. Now the Russians are no longer using the Kursk bridge for railway resupply, because the piers have been weakened following the first Ukrainian attack on this bridge. So the Russians are not taking any chances, and they're not moving trains anymore, or heavy trains, through this bridge. So now they've completely changed their strategy by utilizing ferries. And this is kind of surprising, because I thought the Conroe trader actually was completely damaged and was unusable, but it appears that the Russians were able to repair it. But thankfully, the Ukrainians finished the job yesterday, and they destroyed the Conroe trader at this port facility close to Crimea, which was carrying about 30 fuel tankers, probably heading towards Crimea. And the Ukrainians hit it right when it was loading those storage tankers onto the ferry. So a great hit. The Conroe trader sunk as a result of that. And massive panic in Crimea, because that was the main way the Russians were able to refuel this entire peninsula, not only for the military, but also the local population. So again, the Ukrainians have fully destroyed a vital asset for the Russians, a massive ferry that could transfer key supplies to the Crimean Peninsula. So I'm just hoping that the Ukrainians will finish the job with the Kursk bridge by the end of this year, and further isolate the Russian presence in Crimea in the south. Also, there's some rumors, before I finish the video, that the Russians started transferring a lot of troops from Crimea to Kursk, to essentially, get ready for a counteroffensive operation, likely in Kursk Oblast. So you can see that now the Russians are transferring some troops from all over Russia to Kursk. So they're trying to stabilize the situation, but that doesn't mean that the Russians will literally transfer a massive chunk of troops from Donbass into Kursk. They're not going for that bait, and Putin really is counting on this big punch that he's giving to the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk and Toretsk in New York to be able to essentially have a better bargaining position during the inevitable talks, which will happen eventually. So that's the update for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed my update. I've talked a lot about many changes and map updates, so you guys can let me know in the comment section what you think is going to happen in the next few weeks when it comes down to Pokrovsk, this entire front line, which is difficult for the Ukrainians, but they're holding, and they're holding really well here. Albeit, yes, there's some territory being lost, but this is about 6 months worth of Russian gains here. And if we compare that to the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk and Luhansk, you can see that this is 2 weeks worth of Ukrainian gains, 2.5 weeks. And this is a few days for the Ukrainians as well. So the Ukrainians have offensive abilities, and they can really hurt the Russians as well when it's necessary. So that's why I'm overall very optimistic about the entire situation, and economically speaking as well. Russia's bankrupt. At this stage, Russia's completely bankrupt, and in 2025, I really believe that a massive economic collapse could happen in Russia. I would not be surprised. So with that in mind, I think that Putin will have no choice but to start trying for some peace talks with Ukraine. So we know when the situation is going to be really dire is when Russia is going to bring those conversations first to Ukraine and is going to try to have negotiations with Ukraine first. So that's the video update for today, guys. Thank you for supporting my channel. A huge thank you for 30,000 subscribers. Leave me comments on your opinions, your thoughts, and subscribe to my channel. Slava Ukraini!